I appreciate the opportunity to be on this panel. Lou Frey and I, former Congressman Frey and I, have the opportunity weekly to appear on NPR and talk about issues that we think are of some importance. We hope there's a listening audience. From time to time, Lou, there are people who say they hear us. Lou, of course, was a Republican member of the Congress, I indicated, and of course I was a Democratic member of the House. And as indicated in the introduction, I graduated from UCF, but actually, to be honest, it was FTU at the time, and then was heavily involved in politics upon returning from Vietnam, and fortunately I was elected to the State House at the age of 26, one of the youngest members, and the first graduate of UCF to go to the legislature. However, we have two more very distinguished alumni. One is Senator Lee Constantine. Does this sound better? Yes. It sounds better if you can't hear me? That's what they tell me at home, too. That's what my kids tell me, too, particularly the teenage ones. But Senator Lee Constantine is a graduate of this university, as is Rich Crotty, the Orange County chairman. Rich served in the House and then the Senate, became a constitutional officer. His property appraiser now is the chairman of Orange County. And so I'm very proud to be affiliated with this university. I also went to Valencia. But as I tell Dr. Hitt in public introductions, I say I attended and graduated from the university. I never said that I was educated here. I do not want to do anything to harm the growing credibility of this institution by suggesting that I was educated here or even after leaving here. So I appreciate this opportunity for the panel, and I'm going to make some brief remarks. Obviously, with four panel members, one lawyer and two PhDs, we could spend quite a bit of time here. But I will be brief in my comments. I do understand in the context that you had a few speakers. Who heard the congressman speak yesterday? Okay, well, I'm here to give, I guess, the other point of view of sorts. I know Congressman Feeney. I've worked with him when he was in the legislature, and also Congressman Weldon, but on this we will definitely disagree. As you know, and a lot of this is just basic knowledge, which I'm sure you already have, but with the 58th annual session of the General Assembly, what is very interesting about the United Nations now is with 191 countries that have the vote, I think we all can agree that there have to be changes at the United Nations. Not only because the conflict, which got to be very caustic and continues to be during the Iraqi war resolution, particularly as regards France and Germany and other longtime allies. But I think even Kofi Annan will tell you, in fact, he has a report which is suggesting a restructuring in the United Nations because it has become so bureaucratic. There is such a morass. It is so lethargic so as not to respond, in my opinion, quickly enough to crises. The whole Security Council, the way it's established with your permanent votes and then your rotating votes, where countries like Libya or Guinea or other powerhouses in the world end up having an opportunity to vote on par with France or Russia or China, the United States and Britain, calls into question whether or not we need to restructure the United Nations. It has to be restructured, in my opinion. I think one example that I'll give, with all due respect to the Clinton administration, was how lethargic we were, and the UN was, in responding to Rwanda. By the time we responded to Rwanda in the crisis between the Tutsis and the Hutus there, we had lost 800,000 human beings. For an international confab like the United Nations to move so slowly as to respond to that type of death, that kind of massacre, really raises the question as to the mechanics of this very lethargic, very bureaucratic body and whether or not it is positioned itself or can reposition itself to respond more quickly. I think it is important to have the United Nations. I think it's very important. I think Kofi Annan again was the one who said that if there were not a United Nations, we would create one. Because to me it seems very ludicrous for our political leaders to suggest that somehow that the United States on its own can set the world order and demand what we think is best in the best interest of our country, notwithstanding the interest of other countries. I think that was we bear witness of that again recently in Cancun in Mexico, where the World Trade Organization could not, in fact, negotiate trade policies where the other countries of the world, the developing nations and the underdeveloped nations, felt that there was some parity as regards the types of subsidies that we provide in our own country. You know, it's okay on one hand to work with Pakistan and President Musharraf and say that we want your help in helping us to rid the Taliban of your borders. But on the other hand, if we cannot reach some conclusion, some resolution, some compromise with the senators in South Carolina as regards textile imports and subsidies, which keeps out the Pakistani trade, and then we can't trade the economics for the foreign policy position, then that really tires our hands. So we really do need an international body. If you look at what's happening now in the Middle East, particularly over the weekend with Israel going deep inside of Syria for the first time in 30 years and bombing, if there's not an international forum to at least try to mitigate against some of this type of violence, then what do? Do we just allow every country to be on its own? In fact, I would suggest this administration should be faulted for staying on the sidelines too long after the president was elected, saying that he would not involve himself in the Middle East. And now we have this issue because, as you've heard many, many times, power abhors a vacuum. And if you don't have a major player like the United States and other major countries trying to help build support for some Middle East peace process, and then what we will have is what we have now. There is a vacuum of power, and the terrorist forces will assume those voids, and we'll have a perpetuation of violence. It is very important. If you look at Iraq and what continues to go on in Iraq, I believe that we made a mistake by not waiting until we had more support. President Bush 41 in 1991 in the first Gulf War built up a tremendous amount, almost unanimity, before he went into the Gulf, and we had support for that. I think now in hindsight there was an opportunity, and some people think in foresight there was an opportunity to be able to garner more support before he went in through the United Nations. It is not fair to say, because we don't agree with every vote of the Security Council, that somehow we should leave the international body. That, as someone who was quoted in the paper say, that's what democracy is all about, having the forum to have these debates. In Iraq, and Iran now, because of the nuclear weapons, possibly, the AIDS epidemic, and global trade, international global treaties, such as the Rio Treaty, environmental treaties, we have to have international bodies, in my opinion, to address these issues. We cannot any longer be unilateralist, as some have suggested, particularly in some of the congressional delegation. There are deep divisions. We know that. We might go back and, like I said, restructure some of the United Nations. But let me close with just giving you a few examples of where I think the United Nations plays a key role. Very often do you hear in the debate about UNICEF and the work it does, because some of us remember as kids, you weren't born, but some of us remember as kids, doing the little UNICEF collections with the little milk carton going door to door to try to fund programs internationally for children. UNICEF still plays that role. In fact, it's interesting, prior to the Second Gulf War, before we went into Iraq, the United Nations, under the auspices of the World Food Program, was negotiating with the United States to prepare food for those people who might be impacted by the war. Short of that international agency, there would not have been a World Food Program to try to mitigate against the losses that were brought on by the war. So they play a role. If you look at UNESCO, we're finally going back into UNESCO after being absent so many years. And I understand the controversy, too, because UNESCO had had been hijacked essentially by some of the political interests. In fact, when I was appointed in 1997, the keynote speech was given by Yasser Arafat. Not exactly my first thought about education, scientific, or cultural organization. So you really did have a stigmatized UNESCO, but now we are back in, we're paying our dues, we're paying the arrearages, and now are entitled to 25% of the staff at UNESCO. So as I told my former intern who speaks French, that with a degree, and if you speak French, there are a lot of job openings on behalf of the United States government in Paris starting this year, when we're back actively and also are allowed to have 25% of the staff there. Let me talk in closing about 3 points. One, bless you, something you get free from this speaker anyway. UNESCO is important, but let me talk to you about UN Human Rights Commission, because I think that's a really important body. Having served there, and then last year I returned on my own dime to also be an observer at the United Nations Human Rights Commission proceedings. Now, there is a problem, as I indicated, with the way the UN is structured, because on a rotating basis, Libya was chairman of the United Nations Human Rights Commission. Again, not exactly a poster child. I've never seen Gaddafi's picture any place on a poster promoting human rights. But Libya chaired the panel that year. But what is so important about that confab is that the Human Rights Commission process is a process by which countries get together and they debate and they draft resolutions that publicly condemn other countries for their human rights violations. Cuba, for instance, even though Cuba had just committed 3 people, actually had executed 3 people, and had condemned a number of them to human rights violations and 75-year aggregate jail terms, even when they had done that, the Cuban delegation was so powerful as to only lack 4 votes before we passed a resolution condemning them for their behavior, because you have other countries in Africa and in the Middle East who support Cuba on some issues like this. But at least there is a forum by which we can negotiate these things in public and pass resolutions. When I was there, I led the debate in passing a resolution condemning Russia for their invasion of Chechnya. Now, what I have to tell you as a sidebar, I was sitting next to the Russian delegate. And this guy, if you called central casting and said, get me somebody bigger than Schwarzenegger, who looked like he should be the Chechnyan leader, his hands were like gigantic, and he was gigantic. And, of course, the camera's on, so you don't want to be intimidated when you're negotiating a resolution like this, when you're attacking, Russia for their role in Chechnya. But I kept thinking, I kept smiling and looking diplomatic. I said, God, I hope he just doesn't squash me. But we did pass a resolution. Mary Robinson, the head of the commission at the time, went to Chechnya, spent some time there, and we came back and we passed a resolution condemning Russia for their incursion into Chechnya. But also, there are resolutions against China. There are resolutions against trafficking in women, sexual exploitation. In the Sudan, we had the real serious problem, and continue to have this serious problem, where they intentionally just amputate limbs of small children, recruiting 13, 12, and 10-year-old kids into the military. You have all of these issues that are more pervasive than we acknowledge. But the point I'm trying to make here, unless there is an international forum, an opportunity for country representatives to get together and openly debate whether or not we should pass resolutions condemning countries for their human rights violations, then what do we do? Even with that mechanism in place, we've had the Rwandas, we've had the Sierra Leones, we've had the Sudan. We still have those issues. Without an international forum for us to address these, in my opinion, they would really backslide tremendously. Really would backslide tremendously. And one factor that I think is very, very important is that the role that the non-governmental organizations, the NGOs, the advocates, the role they play, because at the United Nations in Geneva, while the country member states debate all day long, in the afternoon, we also have on the floor, around the side and in the back, representatives from the YWCA, Amnesty International, but more specifically, country representative advocacy groups from individual countries where there are severe human rights violations, from the Sudan, from Sierra Leone, from Chechnya, where these NGOs as volunteers come to Geneva in a safe haven to be able to get on the floor in an international body and condemn the behavior of their government, to publicly condemn their government for violating human rights, systematically violation of human rights. If it were not for the United Nations Human Rights Commission in a forum like that, where would these NGOs be? I would tell you that based on a lot of the testimony, a lot of the advocacy, if they did not have the protection of an independent country like Switzerland, an independent body like the Human Rights Commission, they would have no outlet. They would have no way to advocate against the violation of human rights against women, against children, against minorities. So these bodies play a very major role. I think Congress is now, because we're going to fund the UN and get back in, I think we're doing the right thing. But I would just have to tell you that I believe that there is a real function, a real role for the UN to play. We need to make some changes bureaucratically, but I would tell you in conclusion that if we did not have these international bodies for these opportunities, in my opinion, the human rights would be set back in so many countries for so many years at the cost of so many lives and so many human beings. Thank you.
I think what Dick said was very cogent, very important remarks concerning the role right now of international forums and their vitality, the need to have these, and where we fit as the United States as a world power within that framework. For those of you who are not familiar with the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, or what we call the ICTY, let me tell you just briefly about it. And before I do that, just so you have some context of where I come from in this regard. My first assignment out of law school was as a military first defense attorney, then prosecutor in the JAG Corps in the United States Army. I was volunteered to be a paratrooper, did not serve in combat like Dick did, so I was sort of the paper-pushing soldier. It's a different perspective that we have on the world because we've had different life experiences in that regard. But I went from there to the Department of Justice and served for 10 years as a federal prosecutor here in Orlando, prosecuting white-collar crime, international drug trafficking, money laundering, that sort of stuff. That took me abroad to Russia and Lithuania, to Hungary, Africa, and other places to deal with money laundering issues on a more global level. And ultimately from there I decided that it would be fantastic and a really unique and fortunate opportunity to work at the ICTY, which is located in the Netherlands, in The Hague, in the governmental center there. It's an interesting body, and it's an important body, but it is a body that I think reflects most clearly the pros and cons of the U.S.-United Nations relations as they exist today. And let me tell you what I mean by that. Let's think about what the tribunal is here for. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and the parallel or sister organization, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, were created to deal with what? They're dealing with genocide, crimes against humanity, violations of the laws and customs of war on a scale that is so large and so pervasive. It's very similar to what we saw, for example, in World War II with the tribunals, the military tribunals, dealing with the Nazis, and with the tribunal dealing with the Far East, that is, with Japanese war crimes. Similar types of atrocities, not on the scale, of course, of the Holocaust, but substantial violations of international humanitarian law. Now, what do we do if we don't create a tribunal to deal with these problems? How do we address what's going on within these countries, within these geographic regions? Let's think about Yugoslavia for a second. For those of you who are geographically challenged, like I was prior to living there, when we think of the geography of the former Yugoslavia, we have to put it in context with it being right really in the heart of Western Europe. Think about it for a second. You have Italy, then you have the Adriatic Sea, and directly across from there, a very short hop, is Croatia. Croatia was part of the former Republic of Yugoslavia. You had Croatia, above it Slovenia, below it Bosnia-Herzegovina, then Serbia, then Montenegro and Kosovo. This sits just below Austria. Slovenia borders Austria, which is just a cousin to Germany. This is how close we are to Central Europe. This is how important it is to life in that region of the world. The former Yugoslavia falls apart when a dictator named Tito dies, and it descends into horrible, tragic loss of lives among civilians, ethnic cleansing, pushing people into concentration camps, men and boys, I mean boys, little boys, into concentration camps who are then used to build up and fortify front lines where there's intense direct and indirect firing of weapons, and there's death on a catastrophic level. It's happening every single day during this war. They're being used for forced labor because it's the most dangerous and difficult work, and the various combatants don't want to use their own soldiers to do it. As that's happening, the women and little girls are left essentially defenseless, including old women. They're pushed down in the snow. They're pushed across mountain ranges that I could barely cross over in a 4x4 vehicle. They're pushed across there in horrible conditions under intense enemy fire, and they're being moved ethnically to realign the population so they can then divide the country amongst the Serbs, the Croats, and the Bosnians, to then reshape this area that used to be the former Yugoslavia. If we do nothing about that, it continues to this day. So we have to find a way to deal with it. Now here's where things get tricky. What we find is that the first effort internationally to deal with international justice in a forum that is official and looks like a court of law that we're accustomed to seeing happens in 1944. It happens after World War II. When the atrocities of the Holocaust become known, there is a military tribunal created, the most serious high-level perpetrators are brought to justice, and many thousand lower-level perpetrators are tried by the national courts for their role in the crimes. Following that, a year or so later, is the Tribunal for the Far East, dealing with the crimes committed by the Japanese soldiers against civilians and military combatants who were supposed to be protected. Then we have this amazing lack of activity from the 40s until 1993, which was when the UN Security Council passed Resolution 827, creating the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. Did we have human rights violations between 46 and 93? Sure we did. They happened on a regular basis in Africa and Europe and all over the place. But we sat back for whatever reason and passed various resolutions on a convention against genocide, passed resolutions on conventions against trafficking in women, et cetera, et cetera. We get involved, but we're not taking that final step to sort of close the deal and make this happen. So for some reason, the United States, for this gap of roughly 60 years, is somewhat disengaged. By 1991, we know that there are atrocities committed against the Kurds by the Iraqis in northern Iraq. There is talk about doing a tribunal. It fades. It's only a year or so later that there is talk then about dealing with the problems in the former Yugoslavia. A panel is commissioned, an investigation is conducted, and it takes about 2 years to actually pass a resolution to create a tribunal. It takes another couple of years to staff the tribunal, to figure out what happened in the region, to get judges online, to hire prosecutors, and to start putting cases in the pipeline. Now, at the height of its efficiency, 2003, a decade later, it's talking about its completion strategy. It's winding down. It's just getting good at what it does, and it's winding down. Now, there's a point to this observation, and the point is this, and it follows, I think, what Dick was just saying to you. We, as leaders in this world, the United States as a leader in this world with amazing clout, amazing ability to influence events globally, need to recognize we cannot have it both ways. We cannot sporadically engage in international conventions. We cannot sporadically engage in international justice and then retreat when it doesn't suit our purposes. For those of you who are familiar with the International Criminal Court, it's a body that is a permanent criminal court to dispense international justice, or at least attempt to do so, that came into effect this past July. That's when it became an operating body with an effective date moving forward for violations of international humanitarian law that are committed globally. For those of you who have followed this debate concerning the International Criminal Court, the United States has abstained from ratifying it. Now, there are good arguments for and against ratifying the International Criminal Court and being bound by its jurisdiction and its mandate. There are certainly good arguments on both sides. But the point is that we have to have a forum within which international humanitarian law can be addressed, a forum within which states, that is other countries, sovereign countries, are held to be accountable. And we need to do it in a way that's expedient. Because as we see it now, we had the former Yugoslavia boil over into armed conflict in roughly 1990. We don't engage this problem militarily until 9 years later or 8 years later when we go and start bombing in Kosovo. And in the interim, we're starting to put in place this structure to hold accountable the most serious violations committed at the highest political and military levels. A decade, roughly a decade, to get really geared up to do this. That is simply too slow. When we wait that long, the atrocities continue, they mount, and it spurs off into other areas. The conflict broadens. The region gets more destabilized. It's too slow. We need to engage quickly. We need to bring back the bureaucracy. We need to find a way to make justice on an international level more prompt, to hold people accountable more quickly. The International Criminal Court is designed to try to accomplish that goal. We as Americans, at least our political leadership, are fearful of potential abuses by that body. Let me tell you, there's reason to be fearful. Not to be irrationally fearful, but to be concerned. But the way that I think we deal with that is to engage the problem, not to disengage from the problem. To become actively involved in the court, have a say in its direction, have our prosecutors put there to work on a permanent basis, have people that we think share our view of what criminal justice should be, influencing the process. When I was at the War Crimes Tribunal, what I found most startling is that our rules for procedures, what kind of evidence you can use, how you acquire evidence, the rights of the accused, the duties of the prosecutor, those procedures were amended constantly because we couldn't get a consensus on what was an appropriate procedure. For example, I'd have a discussion in a conference room with a prosecutor from Russia, a prosecutor from France, a prosecutor from Belgium, a couple of Americans, a German, somebody from China, somebody from Sri Lanka. And in the various legal systems they came from, something that I might suggest as a legitimate procedural rule or a legitimate law enforcement investigative technique would be illegal in their country. We had disagreements over what a document is in terms of document production. So you have these fundamental problems. If we disengage from that dialogue, we lose all control. So we want to be engaged in that process to the extent we can. Bureaucracy is killing us in the area of international humanitarian law. It's the layers upon layers upon layers of review before anything gets done. And that is problematic. We need to streamline that to the extent we can. And to do that, I think the United States needs to be engaged. So when we talk about the United States and the United Nations as a building block or stumbling block, it really depends on the issue, the topic, and the time that we're dealing with. If you're talking about the WTO, the World Trade Organization, we're pretty engaged in that. It's very difficult to get consensus in any forum dealing with trade sanctions or tariffs because you have a variety of special interests at play, and they barter them back and forth. Very difficult to come up with these vast schedules. When you talk about international humanitarian law, we were engaged very well in the early 90s, and we seem to be disengaging. We need to have some consistency in the way we approach this. So I would echo what Dick said, and that is that we have a need for institutional structures of this kind, but we need to make it more effective and more streamlined. Thank you very much.
Paul makes a very good point, a very good distinction, and that's a policy distinction. The United States is almost I don't want to say equal, but because it's fully dependent upon the international economy, almost appears to be the complete opposite on international economic issues, where it is so dependent on world markets and the world community for its own domestic economic prosperity. But on issues of international security, national security, we see a different case where the United States may not be or does not appear as dependent on other countries when it comes to security issues. The two cases of Afghanistan and Iraq illustrate certain distinctions within that, and those are two cases I'm going to talk a little bit about. But what I'm intending on covering today are the notions and practices known as preemptive military force and preventive war, and how they are, I guess, treated in what is known or what has become the Bush Doctrine, the George W. Bush Doctrine. The Bush Doctrine is certainly an interesting case. It advances policy objectives that are significantly different from what we've seen in the past, and because it has been doctrine essentially puts forth these notions of preventive war and preemptive military force against terrorists, state sponsors of terrorism. The Bush Doctrine also states that states or non-states that seek to challenge the power of the United States will be confronted by U.S. convention. Two countries that President Bush has labeled members or co-members within a triumvirate of nations in the so-called axis of evil, quote-unquote, North Korea and Iraq. During the Cold War, it is currently in possession of weaponized mustard gas, botulism toxin, anthrax, VX nerve chemicals, sarin gas, phosgene, and plague bacteria. It has also confirmed CIA analysis, CIA reports that it has engaged in a clandestine uranium enrichment program at its Yongbyon nuclear plant in northern North Korea. It has expelled inspectors from the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Plan. It has withdrawn from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and it currently has weapons that are capable of striking Japan and possibly Alaska. But the United States attacked Iraq, and that's what I wanted to focus on now. In mid-July 2003, just a couple months ago, the CIA admitted that intelligence reports that it used, that it recommended that the president use, especially in his second State of the Union address in January, that the intelligence the president used to justify the invasion and to make the public case against Iraq was shoddy at best. While there is no direct evidence linking President Bush to deliberately hyping the invasion of Iraq, the more interesting question is, why did he spend so much time on Iraq when North Korea certainly meets the definition of an imminent, ominous, and looming threat to U.S. national security? The answer, I believe, is twofold, and this is something I think we all should really think about, and that is that the Bush Doctrine, while it advances preventive war and preemptive military force, I'm going to explain the difference between the two in a minute, is that it's a broad enough doctrine, to fit Iraq, because the United States claims the broadly defined and open-ended right to engage in first strike capabilities. Also, the United States has it within its power to launch a preventive war against Iraq with little consequence that Saddam Hussein would have used the WMDs he was being accused of being in unlawful possession of. Although North Korea certainly meets President Bush's definition justifying the use of preventive military force, and preemptive military force essentially deals with the power of a state to attack a state it defines as an imminent threat at the time before it itself will be attacked. North Korea certainly meets that justification, but the implications would be disastrous because North Korea has a significant chemical and biological and potentially nuclear arsenal. Now, keeping those two countries in mind, what really establishes or legitimizes the Bush Doctrine is certainly September 11th, the September 11th terrorist attacks. Without 9/11, the Bush Doctrine wouldn't be what it is today. And foreign policy change certainly would not have taken place. What I argue is that between 1945 or 1947 with the Truman Doctrine and September 10th, 2001, that the United States essentially had a U.S. foreign policy that was, on the whole, guided by two forces, containment and deterrence. States, especially those that the United States had accused of, in particular the Soviet Union, as being in possession of weapons of mass destruction, had to be contained or deterred because of the fear of MAD, mutually assured destruction, which is the idea some of you have learned in your introduction to IR courses or your U.S. foreign policy courses if you are a student. That is, that the justification for launching a nuclear war really cannot be made simply because you're assuring your own destruction. Now, September 11th changed it all, virtually ending, quite arguably ending Cold War-dominated U.S. foreign policy. And what I want to speak about now are the differences between preventive war and preemptive military force. Preventive war is the notion that a state has the right to attack another state, but the state that it is attacking does not meet the definition of an imminent, looming or ominous threat at the time. But it is still going to attack that country because it believes down the road, in months to years to come, that state will present itself as an imminent, looming threat. So it's almost like forecasting the weather. A storm isn't on the horizon, but it could be, so we need to prepare now, although it is not about to strike. That's what preventive war is. Preemptive military force is something almost completely different. Preemptive military force or preemption is the notion that there is a looming and ominous threat that will attack soon. And so, for example, the United States would see itself as in a justifiable justifiable position to attack that state or non-state because it might launch an attack any day now. So what we have between the two concepts and tactics are the differences between them are determined by imminence. With preventive war, imminence is not, the threshold for imminence is not met. With preemptive military force, imminence is met. With Iraq, we were presented with the case before the invasion in March of 2003 that Iraq, the preemptive force because the case had been made that Iraq had been of weapons structure in connection with Al-Qaeda or may not almost 7 months after so question is it's
Security Council, Russia, France, and Germany would have gotten together and said, you guys can't vote, and we're actually adopting a resolution through which the U.S. and the UK need to pull the troops out. So I'm basically arguing, thank you. So basically, the main argument here is that and we can structural similarities. They have an assembly, they have a council, they had the World Court, in a sense, is the continuation of what happened in the League as well. There are very many similarities in the structural perspective. Membership, both were, and in the case of the U.S., are organizations wanted or were supposed to be global organizations. And even procedural, what I just mentioned, that yes, the great powers did have a veto in both cases. But to be honest, I looked for more similarities. I couldn't find more. And I think that actually the differences are important to look at. And initially I want to start off with the main principles. There are two principles in any international organization, any global international organization. The principle of universality. You want everybody there to talk about it. You need everybody there because you need to discuss things. But at the same time, there's a principle of power. You need to recognize that there are some countries that are more powerful were supposed to be global organizations. And even procedural, what I just mentioned, that yes, the great powers did have a veto in both cases. But to be honest, I looked for more similarities. I couldn't find more. And I think that actually the differences are important to look at. And initially I want to start off with the main principles. There are two principles in any international organization, any global international organization, any global principle of universality. You want everybody there to talk about it. You need everybody there because you need to discuss things. But at the same time, there's a principle of power. You need to recognize that there are some countries that are more powerful recognize that there are some countries that are more powerful than others. And somehow you need to engage them more. Otherwise, the organization is not going to be effective. So what basically happens is, if you look at it as a balance, the balance towards universality, the tendency towards universality is much greater in the case of the League of Nations. They did not. I mentioned to you, for example, that everybody had a veto, whether in the council or whether in the assembly. The great powers, the only advantage was that there were permanent members, but very slight advantage. In the UN Security Council, obviously, much more advantage for the powerful states. The veto is always there. Procedural, in the UN Security Council, permanent members always have that veto. Remember, I just mentioned that in the League of Nations, if you were party to a conflict, you were not allowed to vote. Even in the sanctions, I mentioned the sanctions, they were so difficult to take, it was so difficult to take sanctions in the League of Nations because they were taken in the Assembly, not in the Council. So basically you needed to have 51 states all agreeing to take economic sanctions. Okay? So, very different. Another important difference is in terms of membership. Because of these rules, the United Nations has been able to keep all relevant powers as members. And this is not a simple thing. Keep in mind, you may remember that in the case of Korea in 1950, when the Soviet Union decided to walk out, there was a vote, and essentially the United Nations came up with a resolution that ran counter to Soviet interests. The Soviet Union decides to stay on because it realizes that the rules still work in its favor. We are still there. Major powers are still members of the United Nations. That's important to keep in mind because if you think back, the U.S. never joined the League of Nations because it saw that it didn't have the advantages it would want to. Germany decided to leave, Japan decided to leave, and the Soviet Union was expelled. And that was one of the arguments, essentially, for the defeat of the League of Nations. The major powers didn't want to be part of it anymore. So, in a sense, these are the differences. What are the results? Economic sanctions, much more difficult to do in the League of Nations. In the UN, we at least are able to adopt economic sanctions. Collective security, it doesn't happen often in the United Nations, but once in a while it does happen, as compared to the League of Nations where it never was possible. And perhaps the most important thing, what I just mentioned, the advantages to great powers. In the United Nations, what's important is that the UN can never take actions that are counter to the interests of a great power. It's true that it doesn't always take actions that the actions that a great power wants, but at least we're sure that it doesn't take an action against the will of a great power, that it was different in the League of Nations. And also very important that within the UN framework, there was room for countries to act on their own. They're allowed to act on their own if they perceive that there are threats to their security. That is accepted. In the League, it was not accepted. So here are a couple of conclusions I want to draw from this analogy. If there is anything we can learn, if we can sort of try to map this out. And again, we only have one example. It's difficult. There are still differences. This is probably not the best way to figure out what to do with the United Nations. But if we do have that example, let's see if there is anything that we can sort of draw as an example. And for me, the most important thing is people talk about the League of Nations and they compare it with the United Nations. The fact is, if we look at the people who set up the United Nations, they did a great job. They actually were the ones who were looking at the League, looking at the mistakes. It was fresh in their mind, and they actually tried to change it the way they thought best. I would argue, to some degree, they did a terrific job. So we did learn already from the League of Nations, and these lessons are already part of the procedures of the United Nations. There are apparently similar organizations, yet I think the important differences are in the details, the procedural details. I also would argue that the UN has built-in incentives to keep great powers in there. And that is not a small thing, while the League of Nations didn't. The UN does not always, as I mentioned, does not always take action when a great power wants it, but it needs the agreement of others. But again, we're sure that the United Nations will never act against great power interests. And again, that great powers can still act outside the UN framework. For the U.S., why is this important, sort of looking at these conclusions? One, if the United States decides to use the United Nations as a tool of foreign policy, it is one possible tool, right? There are two alternatives. One is that it can actually convince others to act, so it can actually take multilateral action. Worst case scenario, it is indeed a debating society, as President Bush suggested. Personally, I don't see a disadvantage of also having a debating society. The second factor that I want to mention for the U.S. is that the U.S. really needs to know when to use the United Nations and when not to use it. It's an organization that was structured, built, in great part, decided upon by the United States and some other great powers. We need to know when to use it. It is really built by the desire of states. States run the United Nations. Yes, we have a secretariat, but essentially it's states that have the power. And we should be able to figure out when it's in our best interest to use it and when not to use it. And one example is, obviously, people may forget, we did not go to the United Nations when we decided to go to war for Kosovo. We were sure that Russia is going to veto any resolution. We didn't go to the United Nations when we went into Afghanistan, actually. So basically, there is always this escape clause. If you consider that there is an issue that is vital to your security, you don't necessarily need to go to the United Nations. You need to pick and choose your battles, in a sense, in the UN. And the last argument is for the U.S. is even when the U.S. circumvents the United Nations, it must be careful, I would argue, in not hurting the UN's credibility. Because that